In the glittering heart of Paris, where luxury is a language spoken in hushed tones, Amara Moreau, a brilliant linguist fluent in 6 tongues, lives a life of bitter irony. Her world-class degrees are meaningless as she scrubs floors at the elite Hotel Étoile d'Or, her dreams systematically crushed by an invisible wall of prejudice. For 6 years, her true potential has been the hotel's best-kept secret. But a single overheard phone call in Dutch, a fleeting display of her hidden genius, catches the ear of the hotel's enigmatic billionaire owner. This unexpected spark in the opulent darkness ignites a chain reaction, threatening to expose not just Amara's squandered talent, but a deeply entrenched system of discrimination and corruption. From the depths of drudgery to the precipice of power, can one woman's voice so long silenced finally shatter the gilded cage? The answer lies within the shadowed corridors of the Étoile d'Or. The resonant, sonorous chime of an antique regulator clock, a magnificent museum-quality piece standing sentinel in the north alcove of the lobby, its polished brass pendulum swinging with hypnotic grace behind a beveled glass door, had just completed its melodic, multi-toned pronouncement of 10 o'clock in the morning. Within the hushed, almost reverential, cathedral-like expanse of the Auberge Le Rêve Noir, a boutique hotel whispered about in the most elite international circles, celebrated as much for its strikingly avant-garde, obsidian black modernist facade, a bold architectural statement that seemed to absorb the very light around it. As for its legendary, almost impenetrable discretion, the Parisian sun, usually a boisterous and universally welcome intruder, found its golden, life-giving rays artfully diffused and subtly tamed by the heavily smoked, strategically tinted, floor-to-ceiling armored glass windows. These specially commissioned, almost opaque panes, designed as much for security as for aesthetic effect, cast elongated, dramatically shifting, almost melancholic shadows that dance like ethereal specters across the impossibly polished, vein-cut Carrara marble floors, further enhancing the establishment's carefully cultivated aura of exclusive, almost monastic, mystique. It was precisely in this meticulously curated atmosphere of opulent, profound silence and deliberately subdued, understated grandeur that a single, unexpectedly sharp, jarringly modern, and insistently intrusive trill sliced, with almost surgical precision, through the reverential, expensive quiet, the distinct, almost embarrassingly mundane, and universally recognizable ringtone of a common, everyday mobile phone. The very next day, a formal, hand-delivered summons arrived, presented not by the impersonal, almost contemptuous anonymity of the standard postal service, nor by the sterile, characterless efficiency of an encrypted email, but by the impeccably liveried, white-gloved, almost theatrically discreet hand of a senior hotel attendant, a tall, gaunt, silver-haired man whose silent, gliding presence usually signified matters of the utmost gravity, importance, or extreme urgency. He, the magnate, the reclusive owner, the almost mythical figurehead of the global empire, was sending for her. Her, a cleaner. Amara Moreau's slightly outdated, though meticulously cared for, mobile phone, a cherished relic from a less financially constrained, more hopeful period of her life, vibrated with an insistent, almost desperate, almost accusatory urgency against the worn, thin fabric of her standard-issue, ill-fitting uniform pocket. The persistent, unwelcome sensation was a jarring, profoundly discordant note in the usually seamless, perfectly orchestrated symphony of hushed, almost invisible efficiency and practiced, self-effacing invisibility she had painstakingly, over 6 long years, cultivated and meticulously maintained as a shield against the casual indifference of her surroundings. She was, at that precise, inopportune moment, painstakingly, almost obsessively, polishing the already gleaming, intricately wrought heavy brass railings of the majestic, dramatically sweeping grand staircase, a central, almost iconic, architectural marvel in the main atrium of the illustrious Hotel Étoile d'Or, a veritable gilded sanctuary, a hushed opulent refuge for the world's wealthiest, most powerful, most influential, and often most notoriously reclusive individuals. Under normal, everyday circumstances, under the unwavering, omnipresent, ironclad, and often icily, silently critical gaze of Madame Agathe Dubois, the hotel's formidable, undeniably imposing old-school general manager, a woman whose adherence to tradition bordered on the fanatical, a woman who, Amara suspected, saw any deviation from the established hierarchy not merely as an infraction, but as a personal affront. Answering a personal call, any personal call, during designated sacrosanct work hours was an act tantamount to deliberate, almost joyful, professional harakiri. Rule number 1, a commandment more sacred than any other, etched into the very psyche, the corporate DNA, of every single staff member, particularly those relegated to the less glamorous, largely unseen echelons of housekeeping, maintenance, and general domestic services, was unequivocal, non-negotiable, and ruthlessly enforced. Invisibility, unwavering focus, absolute discretion, and zero personal distractions. Yet, the specific flickering sequence of digits flashing insistently, almost pleadingly, on the small, heavily scratched and slightly dimmed screen of her humble device was a beacon, a shimmering, almost hallucinatory mirage in a vast desert of professional stagnation. A number she had been invoking in her silent, fervent, almost desperate prayers for many agonizing months, a numerical lifeline in a vast turbulent sea of thwarted ambition and crushing daily routine. It was the direct, hallowed line to the doctoral admissions department of the Sorbonne, specifically the administrative office overseeing the highly competitive, life-altering doctoral research grants. After 8 excruciatingly long, progressively hope-draining and ultimately crushingly fruitless attempts to secure one of the handful of coveted, fully funded doctoral scholarships for her advanced, profoundly esoteric, and, to most, utterly obscure studies in comparative philology and the economic impact of ancient Mediterranean trade languages. This call, this single, unexpected, almost unbelievable call, felt like the universe itself. After years of cruel indifference, was finally, grudgingly, deigning to toss her a fragile, almost invisible lifeline, a slender, fraying rope into the turbulent, unforgiving, and seemingly endless waters of her current, profoundly unsatisfactory existence. This single, unassuming, almost mundane telephone call she knew, she felt, with a bone-deep, visceral certainty that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a frantically trapped bird, possessed the undeniable, almost terrifying power to fundamentally, irrevocably rewrite the entire, painstakingly drafted, yet deeply, achingly, unfulfilling narrative of her life. This was it. This had to be it. The alternative was a slow, suffocating, professional death. "Just one fleeting, infinitesimal moment, s'il vous plaît, I beg of you," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. A mere, almost inaudible breath of sound, easily lost, she prayed, in the vast, echoing, sonorous space of the magnificent multi-story atrium. Her dark, intelligent, and usually carefully downcast, almost hooded eyes, the eyes of a scholar trapped in a servant's role, darted furtively, almost guiltily, around the expansive, cathedral-like lobby, frantically, desperately, searching for any telltale sign of supervisory presence, any flicker of movement from the dreaded Madame Dubois, or one of her equally vigilant, ever-prowling floor managers. She slipped, with the practiced, almost preternatural stealth of someone long, painfully accustomed to navigating the world unseen, unheard, and largely unacknowledged. Behind a colossal, awe-inspiring, intricately carved Burmese jade dragon statue, a recent multi-million euro and much publicized acquisition from a prestigious record-breaking Hong Kong auction house. Its magnificent, sinuous, powerfully coiled serpentine form, a true masterpiece of ancient, almost forgotten artistry. Its scales gleaming with an inner mystical light offered a temporary, albeit psychologically precarious, and ultimately insufficient shield from prying eyes, disapproving frowns, and potentially career-ending judgmental gazes. It was in that fleeting, stolen, heart-pounding moment of borrowed, illicit secrecy, cocooned by the silent, ancient, almost palpable wisdom of the magnificent jade and the very modern, acutely tangible thrum of her own racing, terrified, yet fiercely hopeful anxiety, that the carefully constructed, rigidly maintained, and deeply unsatisfying trajectory of Amara Moreau's 34 years of existence irrevocably, seismically, shifted on its very axis, tilting with a terrifying, exhilarating velocity towards an unknown, unimaginable, and potentially wonderfully limitless future. This tiny act of defiance, this whispered conversation, felt like the first stone dislodged in an avalanche. "Amara Moreau à l'appareil, bonjour," she answered, her voice a low, carefully modulated, cultured whisper, the French syllables perfectly, almost exquisitely enunciated, a subtle, unconscious linguistic homage to the refined, rarefied atmosphere of the establishment she served. She was meticulously, almost desperately, modulating her tone, her cadence, her very breath to blend, chameleon-like, almost invisibly, with the ambient, expensive, and artfully cultivated quiet of the grand hotel lobby. She remained ever hopeful, a fragile, flickering, almost childlike hope, that her brief, necessary, yet undeniably risky indiscretion would not be noticed, would not be remarked upon, by any of the distinguished, impeccably dressed, and undoubtedly highly discerning guests gliding silently, gracefully, almost regally, through the opulent, sun-dappled space like magnificent, unruffled swans on a placid, undisturbed, private lake. The voice that responded on the other end of the line, a voice that was crisp, precise, almost pedantically formal, and unmistakably, profoundly academic, spoke not in the expected, familiar French, but in flawless, almost breathtakingly fluent, scholarly Dutch. It was the unmistakable, slightly nasal, yet deeply resonant and vaguely familiar baritone of Professor Alistair van der Meer, the renowned, almost legendary, and notoriously exacting head of the Department of Historical and Comparative Linguistics at the ancient, highly prestigious, and academically revered University of Leiden. Professor van der Meer was a towering, almost mythical figure in her chosen esoteric field, a scholar whose seminal, groundbreaking work on the evolution of Proto-Indo-European dialects and their subsequent divergence, Amara had admired, meticulously studied, passionately debated in her own mind, and extensively, reverently, cited in her own academic papers for almost a decade. To hear his voice directly, personally, addressing her was almost too much to comprehend. It was like a deity descending from Olympus to discuss mortal affairs. Amara's cognitive, linguistic switch was instantaneous, almost reflexive, a seamless, nearly unconscious, and deeply ingrained transition. The Dutch syllables, so deeply, intimately familiar from years of solitary, dedicated study, so intellectually stimulating in their complex grammatical structures, so unexpectedly comforting in their logical, almost mathematical precision, rolled off her tongue with the unhesitating, natural fluidity and subtly nuanced, almost native, intonation of a highly educated, lifelong speaker. Her accent, a subject of quiet, intense pride, was impeccable, honed not just through countless lonely hours of poring over dusty grammar books and listening to crackly language tapes in her cramped attic room, but also through a transformative, character-building, albeit financially challenging and often quite isolating, 6-month intensive immersion program in Amsterdam during her financially leaner undergraduate years. A period she recalled with a mixture of fondness for the intellectual awakening and a faint lingering chill from the pervasive loneliness. They spoke, not as servant and master, not as supplicant and benefactor, but as intellectual equals. Their conversation quickly, effortlessly, delving into the nuanced, recondite complexities of her doctoral research proposal. They discussed, with the unhurried, meticulous precision and deeply satisfying intellectual rigor that is the hallmark of true academic discourse, the specific, innovative, and potentially controversial methodologies she intended to employ in her comparative diachronic analysis of extinct Bronze Age Aegean trade pigeons and their surprising linguistic links to early Semitic mercantile languages. They explored, with growing shared excitement, the potential groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting impact of her proposed work on the current understanding of the intricate socio-economic dynamics, the hidden power structures, and the forgotten cultural exchanges of ancient trans-Mediterranean commerce. It was a conversation she had rehearsed in her dreams 1,000 times, a conversation she had almost given up hope of ever actually having. For these few precious minutes, she was not Amara the cleaner, but Amara the scholar, her mind soaring free. Mijn motivatiebrief, Professor van der Meer. Ja, inderdaad, die is van cruciaal belang, Amara responded, her Dutch now flowing with an easy, confident grace, the earlier tension in her voice almost entirely dissipated by the sheer intellectual exhilaration of the exchange. The weight of her uniform, the sting of recent humiliations momentarily forgotten. Ik had begrepen, uit de officiële documentatie van de universiteit, dat de uiterste inleverdatum daarvoor afgelopen vrijdag, de 14e was, om er echter absoluut, onomstotelijk zeker van te zijn dat dit cruciale document de selectiecommissie tijdig en in perfecte staat zou bereiken, heb ik het echter al ruim 2 weken geleden, op de 1e van de maand om precies te zijn, persoonlijk en aangetekend, en zelfs met een extra spoedtoeslag voor internationale verzending, verstuurd vanaf het hoofdpostkantoor hier in Parijs. Amara was referencing, with a meticulous, almost obsessive, attention to detail that was characteristic of her scholarly mind, her formal letter of motivation. This was no mere cover letter. It was a deeply personal, passionately argued, 20-page academic treatise, a document into which she had poured not just months of intense, focused intellectual labor, countless sleepless nights of research and writing, but also the entirety of her carefully hoarded savings for express postage, her fiercely guarded intellect, her burning academic aspirations, and her desperate, almost prayerful hope for a future that extended beyond the monotonous, soul-crushing confines of cleaning supplies, endless corridors, and the pervasive, cloying scent of industrial bleach. The disquieting, almost nightmarish possibility that this pivotal document, this fragile key to unlocking the gilded cage of her current circumstances, might have somehow inexplicably gone astray, lost in the labyrinthine, often indifferent bureaucracy of international academia, or worse, arrived too late to be considered, was a chilling, almost unbearable thought. It was a fear that gnawed at her constantly. Ik maakte me, ondanks al mijn voorzorgsmaatregelen en de extra kosten, oprecht enige, zij het hopelijk ongegronde, zorgen dat het, gezien de recente, onvoorspelbare verstoringen in de internationale postdiensten, misschien toch enige onfortuinlijke vertraging had opgelopen tijdens de verzending. U begrijpt, professor, dat voor iemand in mijn positie een dergelijke administratieve fout catastrofale gevolgen zou kunnen hebben. It was precisely then, At that exact, almost exquisitely timed moment of intellectual engagement and personal vulnerability, as she articulated her carefully phrased, professionally legitimate anxieties in a highly sophisticated academic register of a language few, if any, within the predominantly, almost exclusively, francophone confines of the Parisian Grand Hotel would readily understand, let alone appreciate for its linguistic finesse, that an unnatural, almost preternatural, and deeply unsettling stillness descended, like a heavy velvet curtain upon the usually bustling, subtly resonant, and always impeccably managed main atrium. It was not a sudden jarring silence, but rather a gradual, insidious, creeping cessation of all ambient background sound, the subtle, almost imperceptible, yet definite shift in the distant polite murmur of hushed, expensive conversations from the adjacent guest lounge, the almost inaudible, yet now conspicuously absent pause in the rhythmic, distant clatter of unseen silver service carts being wheeled along carpeted corridors by invisible staff, the momentary yet somehow significant stilling of the gentle, intermittent rustle of freshly ironed, high-quality international newspapers being perused by unseen guests in the plush armchairs of the library annex. It was a cumulative, deeply unsettling effect, nuanced yet utterly, undeniably palpable. It was enough to make the fine, almost invisible hairs on the back of Amar's neck prickle with a sudden, inexplicable, and profoundly unwelcome sense of acute unease, a primal awareness of being observed, of being scrutinized. She slowly, cautiously, almost reluctantly, as if moving through thick, viscous water, raised her gaze from the intricate, hypnotic patterns of the polished, multi-hued marble floor. Her heart, which had momentarily settled into a calmer rhythm during her engaging conversation, now beginning anew, more ominous, more frantic, and deeply foreboding, thumping against her ribs. The jade dragon, her temporary shield, suddenly felt very small. Standing not more than 10, perhaps 12, feet away from her hiding place behind the jade dragon, his bespoke, impeccably tailored charcoal gray Savile Row suit, a silent, understated testament to inherited wealth and unquestioned global power, his stance one of casual, almost deceptive, relaxation, yet radiating an unmistakable, almost palpable aura of commanding intrinsic authority, was Julian Armand Vance. At 55 years of age, though looking at least a decade younger due to a rigorous, disciplined lifestyle and access to the world's finest amenities, he was the enigmatic, intensely private, rarely seen in public, yet undeniably, almost mythically, omnipresent magnate. He was the sole, ultimate owner, not just of the flagship Hôtel Étoile d'Or in Paris, but of the entire sprawling, globally recognized, and immensely profitable Étoile d'Or hotel, resort, and luxury lifestyle empire. His handsome, finely chiseled, and usually carefully guarded, almost inscrutable facial expression, a mask honed by years of high-stakes negotiations and navigating the treacherous currents of international finance, was, at this precise moment, one of undisguised, almost startled, yet undeniably intense, intellectual curiosity mixed with a faint, almost indiscernible flicker of something akin to surprise, or perhaps, Amara dared to imagine, even dawning respect. His gaze wasn't cold, but rather analytical, as if he were observing a rare, unexpected specimen. Beside him, however, forming a stark, almost terrifying contrast, her usually pale, meticulously powdered, and rigidly composed face, now a mottled, alarming mask of slowly congealing, incandescent, almost apoplectic fury, stood Madame Agathe Dubois, the hotel's dreaded, iron-fisted general manager. Madame Dubois, a woman whose own ambitions had long ago curdled into a bitter resentment of anyone she perceived as a threat or an anomaly, particularly educated women of color. Her eyes, typically a cool, assessing, and often witheringly dismissive shade of glacial gray, were now wide, almost bulging, with an unholy, Promethean, almost demonic rage that promised swift, merciless, creatively cruel, and undoubtedly profoundly humiliating retribution. Amara's stomach plummeted with the sickening, terrifying lurch of a faulty, rapidly descending elevator. The earlier, tentative, fragile bubble of elation, of hope, of intellectual exhilaration, generated by Professor Vandermeer's unexpected and wonderfully affirming call, instantly, cruelly, and irrevocably vaporizing, replaced by a cold, creeping, all too familiar and utterly soul-chilling dread. This, she knew with a sickening certainty, was very, very bad. This was, quite possibly, the end. The brief illusion of escape shattered. "Ik moet nu onmiddellijk per direct ophangen, professor," she stammered, her carefully constructed composure, her scholarly poise instantly, catastrophically, fracturing under the combined, crushing weight of those two diametrically opposed, yet equally intense gazes. The elegant, familiar Dutch words, which only moments before had flowed so easily, so fluently from her lips, now suddenly felt clumsy, foreign, almost treacherous in her dry, constricted mouth. "Mijn oprechte, diepste excuses voor dit onverwachte, onprofessionele oponthoud. Ik bel u zo spoedig als menselijkerwijs mogelijk is later vandaag terug. Hartelijk dank voor uw tijd, uw begrip en uw positieve overweging." She ended the call with a visibly trembling hand, her shaking fingers fumbling awkwardly with the small, unforgiving buttons on the side of her phone, the innocuous little device suddenly feeling as heavy, as burdensome, as a block of solid lead in her clammy palm. She had a sickening premonition that she might not, in fact, ever have the opportunity to call Professor Vandermeer back. The dream, so vivid moments ago, was already fading. "Moreau! Dans mon bureau! Ik saute, immédiatement." Madame Dubois' voice, no longer a low growl, but now sharp as shattered, jagged crystal, resonant with years of unquestioned, autocratic authority and a simmering, barely suppressed, class-based resentment, sliced, like a freshly honed guillotine blade, through the opulent, now suffocating, and suddenly terrifyingly silent atmosphere of the grand atrium. Each precisely, viciously enunciated French syllable was a verbal lash, a public indictment, a clear, unambiguous, and deeply humiliating promise of imminent, unavoidable, professional pain. The other staff members in the vicinity, Amara was peripherally, miserably aware, had all frozen in place, their faces a mixture of fear, pity, and a certain grim, almost prurient curiosity. They knew what such a summons, delivered in such a tone, invariably meant. Someone was about to be broken. The subsequent, seemingly endless journey to the cramped, windowless, airless, and perpetually chilly administrative office, strategically, almost symbolically, tucked away in the hotel's damp, subterranean, labyrinthine service depths, a place of hushed despair and forgotten ambitions, felt to Amara like a slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic descent into a personal, bureaucratic, and professionally fatal inferno. Each reluctant, heavy-footed step down the utilitarian, unadorned, gray concrete service stairs, a stark contrast to the opulent marble of the guest areas above, seemed to echo with a hollow, mocking sense of impending, unavoidable, and probably irreversible doom. Amara could physically, almost painfully, feel the heavy, suffocating weight of her colleagues' curious, speculative, and largely unsympathetic gazes boring into her back, some perhaps tinged with a fleeting, reluctant, almost guilty pity. Others, she knew, with a weary certainty, barely if at all, concealing a malicious, almost gleeful flicker of thinly veiled schadenfreude, a grim satisfaction at seeing the over-educated arrogant cleaner finally get her long-overdue comeuppance. She was an outsider, and her perceived hubris in daring to dream beyond her station was to some an unforgivable sin. At 34 years of age, Amara Moreau was, and had always been, a significant, uncomfortable, and often silently resented anomaly, an awkward, challenging outlier within the rigidly hierarchical, deeply conservative, and almost exclusively white structure of the Hotel Étoile d'Or's extensive housekeeping department. She was, to her certain knowledge, and to the constant, unspoken irritation of Madame Dubois, the only woman of color, a proud, though often necessarily, quietly so, and fiercely intelligent descendant of resilient, resourceful Martinican immigrants who possessed not just one, but two advanced, hard-earned master's degrees from one of the world's most prestigious and notoriously demanding academic institutions, a Master of Arts in Historical Linguistics and another in Classical Economic History, both obtained with high honors from the Sorbonne. This uncomfortable, inconvenient, and to Madame Dubois deeply irritating, truth was a fact that the general manager, a woman who prided herself on traditional, almost feudal management principles, an unwavering, almost fanatical adherence to the established rigid social order, and a profound, almost visceral distrust of overeducated subordinates, whom she often accused of lacking common sense or practical skills, seemed to make a concerted, almost pathological, and certainly relentless effort to perpetually, systematically, overlook, deny, or, when forced to acknowledge it, actively, resentfully, and often quite publicly, suppress. Amara was, in Madame Dubois' small, prejudiced world, an inconvenient, indigestible anomaly, a problem to be managed, minimized, and, if possible, eventually eliminated. Madame Dubois, Amara had long suspected, saw in her own reflection a life of unfulfilled potential, a bitterness that she projected onto any woman who dared to aim higher than she herself had achieved, especially a woman of color. You are unequivocally, and I trust, after this morning's performance, now painfully, acutely aware of this establishment's stringent, immutable, and absolutely non-negotiable regulations regarding personal conduct and professional decorum, Moreau, Madame Agathe Dubois began, her voice a low, dangerous, almost reptilian hiss, each word dripping with barely concealed venom and a lifetime of accumulated petty tyrannies. She did not invite Amara to sit. The moment the flimsy, ill-fitting faux wood office door clicked shut behind Amara, with a sound of grim finality, sealing her into the small, airless, oppressively beige, and distinctly unpleasant-smelling room, a faint odor of stale cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant clung to the worn furnishings, Madame Dubois launched her attack. There are to be, under absolutely no circumstances, no exceptions, no personal telephone calls taken or made by any member of the service staff during designated, paid operational hours, especially, and I cannot, it seems, emphasize this fundamental elementary point with sufficient vehemence or frequency for it to penetrate your apparently dense skull, Moreau, not in any public guest areas. It is a cardinal sin, Moreau, a flagrant, unforgivable, and deeply disrespectful, egregious affront to our meticulously maintained, world-renowned standards of professionalism, discretion, and unparalleled guest experience. It is, in short, an act of gross, almost treasonous insubordination. An act that reflects poorly not only on you, but on my entire department, and by extension, on me. Her face was flushed, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her desk. And furthermore, Moreau, Madame Dubois continued, her upper lip, thin and cruelly downturned, curling with a theatrical, almost comical disdain that Amara, despite her fear, found both deeply infuriating and profoundly, existentially wearying, to be conversing so brazenly, so publicly, so foreignly. In what, precisely? Was that peculiar, guttural, and frankly rather common-sounding tongue you were so ostentatiously employing in the presence of our esteemed and undoubtedly bewildered international clientele? Some sort of obscure, uncultured Germanic dialect, I presume? Or perhaps something equally inappropriate, something harsh and jarringly Scandinavian, utterly unsuitable for the refined, sophisticated, and exclusively francophone atmosphere of our uniquely Parisian establishment. The xenophobic undertones were, as always, unmistakable and deliberately wounding. It was a tactic Dubois often employed to undermine those she considered other. Our guests expect a certain Frenchness, Moreau, not the cacophony. It was Dutch, Madame Dubois, Amara corrected, her voice quiet, almost dangerously so but firm, each syllable precise, an instinctive, almost reflexive, and perhaps foolhardy defense of her linguistic capabilities, her intellectual integrity, her very identity. It was a small, almost insignificant act of intellectual defiance in the face of overwhelming power, a correction she regretted with a sharp visceral pang of apprehension the very instant the words left her mouth, knowing, with a chilling certainty, that it would only serve to further inflame the manager's already incandescent, irrational, and deeply prejudiced ire. She saw a flicker of something ugly in Dubois' eyes, the fury of being corrected by a subordinate. Dutch, Martian, Swahili, Esperanto for all I care, Moreau, Madame Dubois snapped, her carefully manicured, crimson-taloned, and surprisingly powerful hand slamming down hard on her cluttered, paper-strewn faux mahogany desk, with a startling, percussive force that rattled the cheap plastic pen holder and sent a small, chipped porcelain figurine of a shepherdess, a kitschy, sentimental item Amara had always found incongruous with Dubois' harsh demeanor, tumbling to the worn linoleum floor, where it shattered with a small, pathetic tinkling sound. Neither of them moved to pick up the pieces. What I profoundly, and I assure you, Moreau, personally, and with the full backing of Mr. Vance, I might add, though why he would concern himself with such trivialities is beyond me, care about what I am incandescently, furiously concerned with, Moreau, is the undeniable, humiliating, and professionally catastrophic fact that Mr. Julian Armand Vance himself, the esteemed, revered, and notoriously private proprietor of this entire multi-billion-euro global chain, the very man who, I might remind you yet again, reluctantly, and some might say, far too generously, signs your meager, barely adequate, and frankly, easily replaceable paycheck, was forced this morning to personally witness with his own disbelieving eyes one of my supposedly trained, supposedly professional cleaning staff in full, conspicuous, and deeply embarrassing view of our most valued, most influential, and undoubtedly most scandalized international clientele, blatantly, shamelessly, and with an almost unbelievable degree of arrogant nonchalance, neglecting her clearly assigned and handsomely remunerated duties, to stand around idly, chattering away like a common ignorant market vendor on her cheap personal telephone, in the very heart, the sanctum sanctorum, of our magnificent world-famous main lobby. The sheer, unmitigated, almost breathtaking audacity, Moreau. The utter, contemptible lack of decorum, of respect, of basic common sense. It beggars belief. It truly, truly beggars belief. You have brought shame upon this house, Moreau. Shame! Her voice had risen to a near shriek, spittle flying from her lips. The profound, burning, almost unbearable injustice of it all, the blatant, staggering, and deeply ingrained hypocrisy, seared like corrosive, molten acid in Amara's throat, threatening to choke her, to silence her, to extinguish the last flickering embers of her defiance. The young, predominantly white, often astonishingly incompetent, and invariably well-connected junior receptionists with their carefully curated, professionally charming, yet often entirely insincere smiles, and their subtle, yet unmistakable, almost regal air of unearned entitlement. Frequently, almost constantly, took personal calls, their light, tinkling, carefree laughter often echoing, unchecked and unrebuked, from behind the polished, gleaming mahogany of the main concierge desk, often in full view of guests with absolutely no discernible negative repercussions whatsoever. Their minor, and sometimes not so minor, indiscretions, their lapses in professionalism, Amara had long, bitterly observed, were invariably, almost automatically, dismissed by Madame Dubois and other senior managers as harmless, youthful exuberance, understandable momentary distractions, or simply, and most infuriatingly, completely overlooked, perhaps even tacitly condoned, due to their perceived superior social standing, their influential family connections, or, quite simply, the color of their skin. Amara remembered once seeing a young receptionist openly weeping on the phone for 20 minutes about a fight with her boyfriend right at the front desk, while a queue of guests waited. Madame Dubois had merely patted her on the shoulder and offered her a cup of tea. But Amara knew, with a chilling, soul-wearying certainty, born of 6 long, hard years of bitter, repeated, and often humiliating personal experience, that this situation, her current precarious situation, was intrinsically, fundamentally, and dangerously different. This was not merely about a broken rule. This was, as always, about something far deeper, far more insidious. This was the familiar, sickening, unspoken, yet brutally effective pattern of institutionalized prejudice, the insidious, invisible, yet crushingly real code of conduct that dictated a vastly different, infinitely harsher, and deliberately discriminatory set of rules, expectations, and ultimately consequences for her, for people like her. This was about power, and Madame Dubois wielded hers like a bludgeon against those she deemed beneath her. "I am, therefore, Moreau," Madame Agathe Dubois declared, her voice now dropping to a low, sibilant, almost triumphant register. A cruel, almost predatory, and deeply unsettling glint of malicious satisfaction animating her cold, calculating, pale gray eyes, left with absolutely no viable, professionally defensible alternative whatsoever. Effective immediately, as of this precise moment, and for a period of no less than 3 full calendar months, your primary, indeed your sole, and I trust appropriately humbling, responsibility within this esteemed establishment will be the comprehensive, meticulous, and unending sanitation and maintenance of all public and staff lavatory facilities located within the Grand Convention Center, which, as you may or may not be aware, is directly annexed to this main hotel building. It is a newer facility, Moreau, and requires a certain diligence that I believe you, with your attention to detail, might appreciate. The sarcasm was thick, cloying. "Perhaps there, Moreau," she continued, her thin lips twisting into a humorless, almost reptilian smirk, "in the echoing, anonymous, and suitably unglamorous solitude of the commodes, the urinals, and the endlessly reflecting mirrors, you can practice, to your heart's content, as many of your peculiar, outlandish, and frankly, entirely useless arcane languages as your restless, over-educated, and clearly undisciplined heart desires. And you can do so, Moreau, without causing any further acute, public embarrassment, any potential financial detriment, or any further unwelcome, disruptive contamination of the refined, sophisticated, and exclusively French-speaking atmosphere of this world-renowned and highly respected Parisian luxury establishment." The unspoken, yet deafeningly loud message was clear. Go back to where you belong. Know your place. Be invisible. Be silent. This was designed not just to punish, but to break, to make her quit. Amara felt her stomach physically clench, then plummet, a cold, hard, nauseating knot of despair, anger, and utter helplessness tightening painfully, almost unbearably, within her. The Grand Convention Center. It was the hotel's universally acknowledged, unspoken, yet universally dreaded, equivalent of internal corporate exile, a professional, social, and psychological Siberia. It meant, in practical, brutal terms, grueling, soul-destroying, almost inhuman, double shifts, often stretching late into the dead, silent hours of the night and the bleak, gray pre-dawn. It meant the thankless, often disgusting and physically exhausting task of cleaning up the aftermath of colossal, ostentatious corporate galas, of boisterous, unruly international trade shows, of lavish, champagne-fueled, and often debauched society wedding receptions, the detritus of other people's pleasures. It meant working almost entirely alone, isolated in the vast, echoing, and often eerily silent halls and corridors of the deserted convention center with no possibility, no hope, of overtime pay, no sliver of recognition, no shred of human interaction beyond the occasional cursory and usually suspicious grunt from a passing bored night shift security guard. It meant just endless, gleaming, mocking rows of porcelain toilets, stainless steel sinks, and vast, unforgiving mirrors, mirrors that would, for 3 long months, relentlessly, cruelly, reflect her own weary, defeated, and increasingly hopeless face. It was, Amara knew, Madame Dubois' signature, psychologically calculated and deeply sadistic punishment, a punishment reserved, with unerring vindictive accuracy, for those unfortunate or foolhardy subordinates whom she deemed particularly insubordinate, those who dared, however slightly, however unintentionally, to step, to stray, out of their narrowly prescribed, invisible, and subservient place, in her rigid, unforgiving hierarchy. Or quite simply, as Amara suspected was often the case, it was reserved for those whom Madame Dubois, for reasons often rooted in nothing more than pure, unadulterated, irrational prejudice, a dislike of someone's education, their background, the way they held themselves, instinctively, viscerally, and irrevocably disliked on sight. Amara, with her quiet intelligence, her undeniable education, and her refusal to be completely, utterly broken by the daily grind and subtle humiliations, had clearly, for a very long time, fallen squarely and perhaps irretrievably into that latter unfortunate category. This was not just a punishment. It was a deliberate attempt to crush her spirit, to extinguish her last spark of hope, to drive her out. Madame Dubois did not fire people she disliked if she could make them suffer first. "You may leave now, Moreau," Madame Agathe Dubois said, her voice now dripping with a final, dismissive, almost bored contempt, a contempt that, despite everything, still felt like a fresh, unexpected physical blow to Amara's already battered spirit. It was the casual cruelty of it that stung the most. "And you should consider yourself fortunate, Moreau. Exceedingly, extraordinarily, unbelievably fortunate, given the egregious nature of your transgression and the profound embarrassment you have caused both myself and, more importantly, Mr. Vance, who I assure you was most displeased, though he is too much of a gentleman to show it to someone like you, that you are not being summarily and quite justifiably, I assure you, dismissed from your employment with this company, effective immediately, for gross professional misconduct, flagrant, repeated insubordination, and a demonstrable, shocking lack of basic common sense and professional judgment. Go now, and do not let me see your face in this main building again for at least 3 months, unless specifically and highly improbably summoned. Your new duties begin at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Do not be late." The threat and the dismissal were absolute and utterly, chillingly final. The door seemed to loom like the entrance to a tomb. That night, in her tiny, sparsely furnished, perpetually drafty, and often quite noisy attic apartment, a space barely large enough for a single, narrow bed, a small, overflowing bookshelf crammed with linguistic treatises and classical literature, and a rickety second-hand wooden table that served as her desk, her sanctuary, her battlefield, located in a distant, far less fashionable, considerably more diverse, and, to Madame Dubois' undoubtedly prejudiced sensibilities, profoundly undesirable arrondissement of Paris, an apartment she shared, out of sheer grinding economic necessity, with two other struggling, creative, and equally impoverished young women. One, a fiercely talented, passionately committed, but perpetually broke avant-garde sculptor named Sophie, whose chaotic clay-covered corner was a constant source of both inspiration and mild irritation. The other, a gifted, intensely sensitive, but largely unrecognized and unpublished poet named Elodie, who often filled the small hours with the melancholic tapping of her ancient typewriter. Amara Moreau finally, in the blessed, anonymous, forgiving darkness, allowed the carefully, painfully, almost physically, dammed up tears of frustration, humiliation, burning anger, and profound, crushing, almost unbearable despair to fall. They streamed silently, hotly, almost corrosively, down her tired, pale face, tracing paths through the faint layer of dust and exhaustion that seemed to permanently cling to her skin, as she stared with a mixture of fierce, defiant pride that felt almost foolish now, and a deep, aching, almost unbearable sense of profound, soul-crushing despair at her small, precious, pathetically inadequate collection of neatly framed, yet now seemingly utterly worthless, almost mocking, academic achievements. Her two hard-earned, proudly displayed master's degrees, one in historical linguistics, the other in classical economic history, both earned with the highest distinction, with laudatory honors, after years of relentless, grueling, caffeine-fueled, sleep-deprived study from the hallowed, intimidating, and deeply revered halls of the Sorbonne. Her various, equally hard-won and internationally recognized language proficiency certificates, official notarized documents meticulously testifying to her advanced professional-level fluency in Dutch, Italian, Mandarin Chinese, and classical Greek, along with a more than competent, academically certified working knowledge of biblical Aramaic and even a smattering of ancient, almost forgotten Phoenician. They hung, like forlorn, forgotten, almost accusatory trophies from a previous, more hopeful, almost alien life, on the peeling, discolored, water-stained wallpaper of her small, designated section of the cramped, shared living space, a constant, painful, almost unbearable reminder of her thwarted ambitions, her unfulfilled, perhaps unfulfillable potential, her seemingly inescapable, dead-end, soul-destroying reality. 6 long, arduous, spirit-diminishing, hope-eroding years. 6 years of relentlessly, almost obsessively, scrubbing hotel rooms until her hands were raw and chapped, of meticulously, almost reverently, polishing floors and fixtures until they gleamed, with an almost unnatural, sterile, almost accusing brilliance, of inhaling day after day, week after week, year after year, the cloying, acrid, lung-burning chemical scent of industrial-strength cleaning agents, a scent that seemed to have permanently, irrevocably permeated her very skin, her hair, her few meager clothes, her troubled, restless dreams. All this sacrifice, all this daily grinding degradation, all this silent internal suffering, while desperately, painstakingly, almost obsessively, trying to save every spare, precious euro, every carefully hoarded, hard-earned centime, first for the crippling tuition fees and meager living expenses of her 2 demanding, simultaneous master's degrees, and then, with ever-dwindling, almost extinguished, fragile hope, for the elusive, almost mythical, fully funded, life-changing PhD program that seemed, with each passing, frustrating, identical year, to recede further and further into the hazy, unattainable, almost mocking distance, like a cruel, tantalizing, and ultimately illusory mirage in a vast, unforgiving, sun-baked desert of bitter disappointment and mounting despair. 6 long, brutal, spirit-crushing years of meticulously, almost compulsively, crafting, endlessly revising, and hopefully, prayerfully, almost ritualistically, submitting literally dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of individually tailored, carefully researched resumes and painstakingly personalized, eloquently written cover letters, sending them out like fragile paper messages in a bottle into the vast, indifferent, and seemingly impenetrable, ironclad ocean of the European professional world, only to receive, in frustratingly infrequent return, polite, formulaic, soul-crushingly impersonal, computer-generated rejections, or, far more often, and perhaps even more painfully, a deafening, hope-destroying, spirit-eroding, almost contemptuous silence. And on those rare, tantalizing, almost unbearable occasions, when her undeniably impressive paper qualifications had, against all astronomical odds, actually managed to secure her a coveted, nerve-wracking in-person interview she had felt, with a sickening, almost physical wave of anticipatory despair. Her evident intellect, her passionate, articulate enthusiasm for her chosen field, her demonstrable, quantifiable, and often quite brilliant academic achievements seemed to inexplicably, almost magically, vaporize, to dissipate like insubstantial smoke in the face of subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, expressed prejudiced assumptions, unspoken, yet almost tangibly palpable, gender and racial biases, and the crushing, often unstated, yet clearly, devastatingly communicated, judgment that she, Amara Moreau, with her dark, foreign-looking skin, her faintly exotic, difficult-to-place accent, despite her perfect French, her quiet, thoughtful intensity, her over-education, a coded, dismissive term she had come to dread, simply didn't fit the expected, unwritten, and almost invariably white, male, conventionally attractive, and comfortably corporate profile. It was a silent, invisible, yet brutally effective, almost impenetrable, wall of exclusion, a wall built of centuries of prejudice and unearned privilege, a wall she had, for 6 long, exhausting, and increasingly hopeless years, battered her head, her heart, and her formidable intellect against to absolutely no discernible, positive avail. Tonight that wall felt higher, thicker, colder, and more utterly, crushingly insurmountable than ever before. Tonight, for the first time in a very, very long time, Amara Moreau, the scholar, the linguist, the dreamer, felt truly, utterly, comprehensively, and perhaps, finally, irrevocably defeated. The fight, it seemed, had gone out of her. The convention center bathrooms loomed in her mind, a gray, porcelain-lined oubliette. As Amara's extraordinary journey from overlooked cleaner to unlikely power player unfolds, what does it truly reveal about the hidden talents within us all and the societal barriers that often keep them suppressed? Have you ever witnessed or experienced such systemic injustice firsthand? We invite you to share your reflections and personal stories in the comments below. Your voice matters. If Amara's fight for recognition and justice resonated with you, and you're eager for more narratives that challenge, inspire, and ignite conversation, please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Become part of a community dedicated to uncovering powerful truths.